The moment the box opened, everything changed. Charles Spencer just dropped a piece of paper on a Thursday morning that basically did what 30 years of palace PR couldn't do, which is prove that the entire story we were told about Princess Diana and Princess Anne was wrong. Not like partially wrong or missing some details, just completely fundamentally the opposite of what actually happened. And the way it all came out is almost as interesting as what the letter actually says. Because the timing of this reveal, the specific details about how the letter was delivered, and the fact that there are apparently 2 copies of this document sitting in different vaults across England, none of that is an accident. This was a coordinated release, and the palace legal team apparently spent an entire night trying to figure out if they could stop it before realizing they had absolutely zero grounds to do anything about it. So let's start with the box because the visual of this moment is honestly kind of cinematic. Charles Spencer is sitting in the library at Althorpe House, which is the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire. And if you've ever seen photos of this place, it looks exactly like what you'd imagine an English aristocratic library to look like. Tall windows, thousands of leather-bound books, that specific kind of morning light that makes everything look like a period drama. He's sitting at this heavy walnut desk, and there's a mahogany box that was just retrieved from a secure vault underneath the actual foundation stones of the mansion. Like not a filing cabinet in the basement, a vault under the foundation. He puts on white cotton archivist gloves, which is a detail that matters because it tells you this isn't a casual family photo album situation. This is document preservation protocol. He takes out an iron key, turns it in the brass lock, and inside this box lined with faded blue silk is a single sheet of light blue writing paper. And the date on that paper is August 10th, 1997, which if you know your timeline is exactly 21 days before Diana died in Paris. That date alone changes the weight of every single word on that page. Now the letter itself. The paper has the embossed red crest of Kensington Palace at the top, and it's covered in Diana's distinct handwriting using a black roller ball pen. And Charles Spencer didn't just find this and immediately call a press conference. He spent 48 hours working with a senior forensic document examiner from the London Probate Archives to verify that the signature was authentic before he said a single word publicly. They compared the ink pressure points and consistency against hundreds of verified letters in the Spencer family repository, and the verdict came back ironclad that morning. This is Diana's handwriting, Diana's words, Diana's signature. There's no ambiguity here. What she actually wrote is where this story completely dismantles everything we thought we knew about the relationship between these 2 women. For 3 decades, the standard narrative pushed by royal biographers and the press was that Diana and Anne were basically rivals. The framing was always that Diana was this high-fashion, emotionally expressive, media-savvy celebrity princess and Anne was the no-nonsense, traditional rural, charity-focused royal who had no patience for any of that. The assumption was that they avoided each other behind closed doors and had nothing in common. This letter proves that during the absolute darkest period of her marital separation, when most of the aristocracy had already dropped her, Diana turned to Anne as her primary source of guidance and protection. Not a friend from her social circle, not a celebrity confidant, the king's sister. And the way she addressed her tells you everything about how close they actually were. Diana didn't use formal aristocratic titles. She addressed Anne simply as Anne with an intimate tone that apparently exposed how vulnerable she was during that summer of 1997. The letter outlines her growing fear about the rigid institutional protocols being used by senior courtiers to manage the public profiles of her 2 sons, William and Harry. She wrote that she felt an urgent need to build a permanent independent protective barrier around the boys' emotional development, and she believed Anne was the only member of the entire Windsor household who had the raw courage to stand against the palace bureaucracy. Think about what that means. Diana looked around at every single person in that family and concluded that the one person who would actually fight for her children was the woman the press kept describing as cold and distant. Now, here's where the logistics of this letter get really interesting because Diana didn't just drop it in the regular mail at Kensington Palace. She knew that the central palace machinery was monitoring her correspondence during this period. So she used what's being described as a highly secretive and formal postal network used by younger members of the aristocracy to bypass the senior courtiers. She instructed her most trusted personal chauffeur to drive the envelope directly to the equestrian stables at Gatcombe Park, which is Anne's private estate, and deliver it by hand to Anne's head groom under strict orders of absolute confidentiality. So this wasn't mailed. It wasn't sent through any official channel. It was hand-delivered to the stables by someone Diana trusted completely. And from there, it went directly to Anne's desk. The palace screening machinery never touched it. Charles Spencer apparently gave Clarence House a heads-up before this went public. His legal team delivered a high-resolution photocopy of the document to the king's private secretary on Wednesday afternoon as a formal courtesy, giving them a window to review the text before the announcement. And the arrival of that folder triggered what's being described as frantic activity in the palace legal department. Senior solicitors spent the night reviewing the 1993 Royal Trust Acts to see if the Crown had any statutory grounds to file an injunction blocking publication. They ultimately concluded that because the original physical letter was discovered in the private archives of Althorpe House, and because it was addressed to a private individual rather than a state official, the Crown had zero constitutional authority to suppress it. It was an independent historical artifact entirely outside the jurisdiction of the Official Secrets Act or the Royal Collection Trust. The palace lawyers had to basically tell the king's advisors, "There's nothing we can do here. This is happening." So what was in the letter that made the palace legal team scramble like that? Diana wrote that she had discovered a specific administrative document through a trusted source inside the palace registry office just 48 hours before she sat down to write to Anne. That leaked document detailed a confidential plan by senior court officials to systematically alter her global security arrangements and reduce her personal protection detail to a minimum level with the goal of pressuring her into surrendering her independent media operations. She explicitly used the phrase administrative trap to describe the legal mechanisms being prepared by the king's solicitors. She explained that the ultimate goal was to use an ancient clause within the 1772 Royal Marriages Act to launch a private custody dispute, asserting the sovereign's overriding prerogative to control the education, residence, and daily movements of William and Harry. That's not a vague fear. That's a specific legal strategy she obtained details about, and her primary concern wasn't her own public standing or her travel logistics. She wrote that her deepest fear was the cold institutional environment that would consume her sons if she were suddenly removed from their daily upbringing. She described the senior advisors running the central household as a corporate board of directors who viewed the young princes as functional pieces of state machinery rather than developing human beings who needed genuine parental affection. That's a devastating characterization. And it's made even more devastating by the fact that she was writing this to the king's own sister, essentially saying your family's apparatus is going to emotionally destroy my children unless someone stops it. The appeal to Anne specifically is where the letter apparently becomes almost unbearable to read. Diana wrote that she was begging Anne to look past the superficial court gossip that had been manufactured to divide them over the past decade. She said she chose Anne because Anne was the only member of the Windsor family who possessed the raw courage to look a reigning monarch in the eye and defend the basic human rights of a mother. She wanted Anne to act as an unyielding emotional barrier between her boys and the traditionalists who wanted to shape them into distant, unfeeling symbols of the state. The forensic examination of the original manuscript actually showed that Diana spent several hours formatting this warning. The reverse side of the page has multiple corrections where she scratched out initial sentences and replaced them with more precise, legally binding language. She was making sure that if this document was ever retrieved during a future family crisis, palace attorneys couldn't dismiss it as an emotional outburst. She was building a legal record, but here's the detail that apparently sent a fresh wave of panic through Buckingham Palace on Thursday morning. In the middle of the second page, Diana referenced a secret personal repository containing over 200 original letters and diary entries from her school days and early marriage. She told Anne she had hidden this repository completely outside the palace infrastructure, entirely separate from the royal archives at Windsor Castle. And she instructed her personal trustees to release the entire archive to the public if the central administration ever attempted to completely block her access to her sons following the upcoming autumn term. So there's potentially a vault somewhere, possibly in Fleet Street, according to some reports, containing 200 documents that Diana specifically set aside as an insurance policy. The king's legal teams are apparently working through the night trying to track the movement of Spencer family holdings from that era to locate this vault before anything else surfaces. That's not a comfortable position for the palace to be in. The letter ends with a postscript that Diana added just before sealing the envelope. She wrote that she was leaving for the Mediterranean the following morning with a deep sense of administrative anxiety, feeling that her time to secure her son's emotional safety was rapidly running out. 3 weeks later, she was dead. That postscript transforms this document from a piece of family correspondence into something that reads like a final testament. Now let's talk about Princess Anne's side of this, because what she did with this letter for 30 years is honestly remarkable. She kept her copy in a fireproof military-grade combination safe bolted into the stone wall of her private study at Gatcombe Park, hidden beneath layers of equestrian breeding logs and family land titles. That safe remained completely untouched by any palace assistant or household surveyor for exactly 3 decades. Through every documentary, every memoir, every leaked tape recording sold to international broadcasters for millions of pounds, and gave zero interviews. She authorized zero press statements. She kept that letter locked away and she said absolutely nothing. The structural facts of her royal duties explain why Anne has spent her entire adult life operating as the foundational pillar of the crown's traditional infrastructure. Her primary allegiance is to the long-term continuity of the state, not to personal PR campaigns or media cycles. She understood that revealing a letter alleging an administrative conspiracy inside the palace would have triggered a massive constitutional crisis during the delicate transition period of the late 1990s. The public fury would have completely derailed the stabilization of the monarchy and directly threatened the future reign of her nephew William. So instead of launching a public war against the palace advisors, Anne chose to absorb the emotional burden of the letter in total isolation and quietly execute the protective role Diana had begged her to assume. And the court circular records actually back this up. Between 1997 and 2005, Anne quietly adjusted her official charity calendars to ensure she was consistently present at the Windsor estate during the boys' academic breaks. She didn't bring camera crews, she didn't invite royal correspondents. She just arrived in her private car, spent hours walking with William and Harry through the quiet pathways of the Great Park, and provided them with a stable, down-to-earth space completely insulated from the PR maneuvering happening at Clarence House. While the tabloids were portraying her as a cold traditionalist indifferent to the tragedy, Anne was being the exact emotional barrier Diana had prayed for. She just never told anyone she was doing it. The tension over the secret came to a head in 2026, when palace archivists began preparing for a major national milestone celebration. The master of the household requested a comprehensive audit of all private correspondence files at Gatcombe Park, wanting to transfer any sensitive historical documents to the central repository at Windsor Castle, where they could be vetted and restricted under the 50-year rule of state privacy. Anne rejected the audit instantly. She told the central registry clerks that her private safe contained personal family correspondence entirely separate from the state's administrative workflow, and she refused to hand over the keys. The palace legal department realized they had zero statutory grounds to force a daughter of Queen Elizabeth to surrender her private inheritance papers without creating a highly damaging internal court battle, so they backed off. The coordination between Charles Spencer and Anne before this announcement is worth noting. The Earl traveled to Gloucestershire by private car to hold an urgent briefing with Anne inside her private study. He informed her that his legal team had independently verified the original manuscript found in the Althorpe Library, and he believed the public interest required immediate publication to correct the false historical narrative. Anne listened in complete silence, leaning her hands on the edge of her roll-top desk, and then gave her quiet formal endorsement to proceed. She recognized that with the Althorpe copy fully verified by forensic experts, any further attempts to hide the duplicate would look like a desperate palace cover-up. Later that afternoon, the safe was opened so her personal solicitors could cross-reference the text against the Althorpe manuscript one final time. The duplicate light blue paper matched exactly. The reaction inside Buckingham Palace when this went public was apparently chaos. Over 300 distinct administrative computers within the palace network simultaneously accessed the high-resolution digital scans uploaded from the Althorpe press server. The standard workflow of scheduling diplomatic visits and drafting minor press releases stopped completely. Senior media directors abandoned their morning tea to crowd around the primary media monitoring wall, watching BBC News and Sky News correspondents standing outside the palace gates holding up early print editions with front-page headlines analyzing the phrase administrative trap that Diana had written 33 years ago. The strategic damage to the current court structure is significant. For years, the palace PR machinery framed the royal friction of the 1990s as a simple tragic breakdown of a private marriage, spending millions from the sovereign grant to project an image of modern streamlined continuity. The revelation of a hidden alliance between Diana and Anne completely dismantles that corporate narrative. Public polling showed an immediate massive wave of sympathy for Anne, with over 80% of respondents praising her for carrying the emotional burden in total silence to protect the young princes. Meanwhile, public perception of the old administrative guard plummeted because the text explicitly portrayed the palace bureaucracy as a cold, controlling machine that prioritized institutional control over basic human compassion. This created an immediate operational problem for the communications team, because they had been scheduled to launch a major media campaign on Friday morning to promote Queen Camilla's upcoming state charity appearances in London. After the viral explosion of the Althorpe letter, the media directors realized that proceeding with fashion and lifestyle updates would look incredibly tone-deaf, while the public was reading about a mother's final desperate warning. The king's chief secretary froze the entire promotional schedule and locked the media assets back in the archive safe until the cultural storm stabilizes. Then there's the phone call between the king's study at Clarence House and Prince William's private office at Adelaide Cottage. The king's advisors wanted to draft a joint defense of family statement that would acknowledge the historical value of the letter, while gently framing it as a reflection of a bygone era of court tension. They wanted William to sign his name to text claiming the family had long since moved past the administrative conflicts of 1997. William rejected the palace script completely during that 20-minute call. He informed his father's private secretary that he would not authorize his staff to participate in any PR campaign designed to minimize or spin his mother's original words. He stated that the handwritten note left by Charles Spencer was an authentic piece of his own family history, and he fully respected the absolute non-disclosure that his Aunt Anne had maintained for 30 years to protect his childhood education. By refusing to back the central administration's defensive strategy, William effectively isolated the king's advisors and left the central palace apparatus entirely exposed to the full force of public scrutiny. The afternoon shift at the palace press office tells you everything about how unprepared they were. Phones ringing continuously with hundreds of international journalists demanding to know if the Crown would launch a formal investigation into the secret repository mentioned in the text. The press secretaries had absolutely no answers. They could only read a repetitive generic statement about the private nature of historical family papers, their voices cracking slightly under the pressure of a historical revelation that no amount of palace diplomacy could contain. The final administrative verification was stamped into the database at the London High Court Probate Registry at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. A senior court archivist placed digital encryption codes over the newly processed file, cataloging it under the permanent National History Logs. The original 1997 light blue Kensington Palace paper is now officially registered in the public archives of the state, placed in a secure temperature-controlled archival box where it's safe from any future attempts at palace censorship or administrative modification. Outside the iron railings of Buckingham Palace, thousands of people stood in silence holding evening print editions featuring full-page replicas of Diana's sloping handwriting. The polling that evening showed over 90% of respondents expressing deep gratitude for the protection Anne provided to the young princes. So where does this leave the modern court? King Charles's central administration is facing a reality where 30 years of narrative management has been neutralized by a single sheet of paper from the Althorp vault. The future court led by William from Adelaide Cottage has emerged completely insulated from the fallout because the public now recognizes that his modern style of leadership is directly aligned with the emotional blueprint his mother fought so hard to protect. The old guard of advisors has been forced to retreat into silence. And Princess Anne, the woman the tabloids spent decades painting as cold and distant, has been revealed as the person Diana trusted most to protect her children from the machinery of the institution itself. The voice from the past didn't just add a footnote to royal history, it completely rewrote the story we thought we knew.